Theodosius Dobzhansky was a geneticist at Columbia University. And he once said that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. Now remember, in science, a theory is even more powerful than a law because it explains how something occurs, not just that it occurs. So the theory of evolution explains how life on Earth has evolved and how it has changed, and that's pretty powerful. So one of the first things that you have to understand is that evolution and natural selection do not select for perfect organisms. They are selecting for organisms that are potentially just good enough. Why? Because selection acts on only existing variations. New variations don't arise just because they're wanted. They don't arise just because they're needed. That means that evolution is limited by historical constraints. In other words, evolution can tinker with the adaptations and the DNA that already exist. But it's VISTA that is going to go ahead and select for those variations that are more successful. And most of the time, adaptations are often compromises. Remember, organisms have to do different things, right? There's seals, they can walk on land, and they have to swim in the water. So with evolution, chance, natural selection, and environment all interact to result in this Darwinian idea of descent with modification. Now, in the time of Darwin, molecular genetics was not something that was known about. So we're going to start off with something that Darwin and his contemporaries could actually observe. And one of those was the idea of artificial selection. Artificial selection is the identification by humans of desirable traits in either plants or animals, and then the humans enhance and perpetuate those through selective breeding. So we basically start off with this raw genetic information, and then we tinker with the variations to selectively develop a particular type of phenotype. So we did this with wild mustard plants, and we got kale and kohlrabi and broccoli and cauliflower, cabbage and Brussels sprouts. And we did this again with our domesticated animals, horse, cows, chickens, goats, dogs. If humans can tinker with genetic components of an organism, so can nature. And Darwin and his contemporaries realized that to be true over 150 years ago. Now, something else that was possible to gather information from in Darwin's time were fossils. Now, believe it or not, the fossil record of specific groups is pretty darn complete, especially considering how rare fossilization is. However, there are people who say that because not every life form that has ever existed has been fossilized, that the fossil record is incomplete and can't be used as evidence for evolution. Well, to them, I say this. Take a moment. Look at this puzzle. What's it of? How do you know? Clearly, there are pieces missing, and yet you can still see what the main image is of. It's of a ladybug on a flower. Okay? Now, that idea is the same one for the fossil record. You don't need every single part played out for you to still see the trend. There are going to be gaps. So the fossil record is a record in geological time, and it documents how organisms changed over time. And you can look at the spades of evidence, from whale evolution to horse evolution, even to our own evolution. Are there fossils missing? Sure there are, you bet. But that does not change the idea that you can see that these organisms, and all organisms, have evolved or changed over time. So with horses, it's believed that they are descendant from this little Hyracotherium. These were small and almost cat-sized creatures that lived in forests. There's my really, really good picture of a forest. And scientists believed that they lived in these forests because of the types of plants that were found in the same fossil layer as these creatures. And they can support this with extensive high-resolution imagery of their dentition. You see, your food leaves little microscopic scrapes on your teeth. So by comparing comparing these microscopic scrapes left behind from food, scientists can conclude that the scrapes on their little fossilized teeth correspond with what you would actually expect to find in an herbivore that lived in a forest. But over time, their environment started to change. It became drier, and the forest began to retreat, and it gave way to more grasslands. That's this really good picture here. And now there's no longer spaces like these bushes and the undergrowth from before to hide in. Now, longer legs and running fast became a selective advantage. And over time, you can see organisms being selected for with longer and longer legs. They had the survival advantage. So as the environment changed, so did the organisms that lived in it. And this is echoed for whale evolution too. Their ancestor was a wolf-like creature that walked on land. Now, because of some selective pressure, maybe predation, maybe food foraging, those organisms who moved towards spending more time in the water had a selective advantage. This trait is going to be selected for, or was selected for, and amplified over thousands of generations. And in fact, scientists have found the skulls of these creatures over the course of their millions of years of change. And the paleontologists learned that these creatures' noses moved from the front of their snout, like the nose of a dog would lie right around here, right? And it started to move up. It migrated up the skull, here and here, until it actually migrated to where the blowhole is today. That means that the ancestor of the whale was terrestrial. In fact, think about how terrestrial animals on four legs run. Close your eyes and picture a dog or even a cheetah running. See how their spine curves? Now think about how a whale swims. It's the exact same gait, minus the legs. Pretty cool, right? Now, some whales even have what we call vestigial structures. Now, vestigial structures are either various cells or tissues, organs, or body parts which are no longer functioning in the same way the ancestral form of the trait originally functioned. You can see that, like I said, in some whales. For example, a vestigial hip bone. Okay? Now, that's a vestige of their terrestrial ancestral path. That's a tongue twister. Now, some examples of this vestigiality can include anatomical, like in humans that could be tailbone or wisdom teeth, or the inside corner of the eye, which at some point was a nictitating membrane in other species. Or it can be behavioral, like goosebumps, or the palmar grasp reflex, which is actually a primitive reflex found in our own infants and in most primates. When any object is placed in a little infant's palm, the fingers flex reflectively around the object. And it's kind of helpful so the baby doesn't fall out of the tree, no? But in terms of the evolutionary hold over, that's kind of like an ancestral whisper of what it at least once was. So although structures can be called vestigial, right, they often appear functionless. A vestigial structure may actually retain lesser functions or actually develop minor new ones. So in some cases, structures once identified as vestigial simply had an unrecognized function, like with our appendix. Although previously thought of as a vestigial structure, new research is actually pointing that our appendix is potentially playing a role as a secondary immune organ and as a reservoir for helpful bacteria in our gut, which could actually help our microbiome. Okay, now coming back to the fossil record for a moment. Most fossils are found within layers of sedimentary rock called strata. You can see these layers here. Deeper strata are usually older, and therefore fossils from different time periods can be compared. Analysis of fossils from different strata suggest that more complex modern organisms evolved from simpler, more ancient ones. And if you were potentially looking for a fossil, right, between the time periods A and B, you would just use logic and look at the time period for B. And often in that time period, you can see something called a transitional fossil. So Archaeopteryx that we see right here is a very famous transitional fossil. So this is one of the earliest known flying species from the late Jurassic period, which means it lived around 150 million years ago. And it exhibits many shared primitive characteristics with more basal dinosaurs. Characteristics such as teeth, which are a little hard to see here, a long bony tail, and these pinnate feathers, which means they look kind of like this, like regular bird feathers that we see today. But Archaeopteryx also possesses asymmetrical flight feathers on its wings and tail, and wing feather arrangements shared with modern birds. So this is neither bird nor dinosaur, but it is a transitional fossil. Now, something that was beyond Darwin and his time was this idea of molecular genetics. However, this modern idea still supports the idea of descent with modification. The sequence in DNA and proteins is basically a molecular record of evolutionary relationships. The more similar they are, right, the closer they are going to go ahead and be related. The more different they are, so we can go ahead and compare that, let's say, with the lamprey, the longer ago they diverged. So you can go ahead and compare genes and DNA, or you can compare proteins and amino acid sequences with this. And of course, there's also going to be anatomical evidences like homologous structures. And that's when you have organisms that have similar structures, like we can see here in this bone arrangement here in front of us. So the bones are arranged in the same way due to a common ancestor, but over time, these structures don't have the same function any longer. For example, the hand that evolved for grasping in the human might have the same layout as in a cat limb, but that limb evolved for running. And again, same structure here in the whale, fin, but that evolved for swimming. And the same structure for the batwing, but again, it evolved for flying. So this is due to divergent evolution. You have this common ancestor and you diverge outward. But you want to be careful, because just because an animal looks similar does not mean that it has recent common ancestry. For example, these animals look really similar. The sugar glider and the American flying squirrel, right? But that does not mean that they have recent common ancestry. So, for example, one of them, this little sugar glider, is from Australia, and the other one is from North America. Now, these two continents have not been together since around 250 million years ago. There is nothing recent about that. So why does the sugar glider and the little gliding squirrel look the same? And the answer is the same environmental pressures are selecting for the same traits. So how about this dolphin and this shark? Okay. Are these similar body types? Yes. But are they due to homology? No. The dolphin is a mammal and the shark is a fish. So again, no recent common ancestry there. Those structures are then said to be analogous. The structures are similar because of, but they are unrelated organisms. So again, why would that happen, right? These structures are similar because they evolved to do the same job, but not because they were inherited from a common ancestry. And we call that convergent evolution. And this bat here, this hawk, and this dragonfly, they all fly, but they are flying, or this happens because they evolved to do the same job. One is a mammal, one's a bird, and one's an insect without any bones at all. There's no common ancestry there. Or I should say there's no recent common ancestry. There's common ancestry if you go back far enough with everything. So this is this idea of convergent evolution. The same body plan evolved because the environmental selective pressures were the same. Another evidence is comparative embryology, and this has to do with similarities in development are evidence for common ancestry. Similar internal structures, similar development. And this last one, biogeography. It's going to be the study of geographical distribution of organisms, and it provides information about how and when species may have evolved. So, why should extinct species and living species be found on the same continent? Well, fossils provide evidence of long-term evolutionary changes, and they're going to go ahead and document the past existence of species that would be now extinct. And before I said this was the last one, but I lied. There's one more I want to go over. And this really means that we can see evolution happening too when we look at these examples. So the first thing that I want to look at here is this idea of when we're looking at antibiotic resistance in bacteria. When you apply an antibiotic, some may have natural resistance, not immunity, resistance. And that would be in this kind of like peach red image. And those that do not have that natural resistance, the antibody or the antibiotic is going to go ahead and kill, right? So that means all these little blue guys are going to go ahead and die. All that's left are these little red guys that were or showed some form of resistance. They survived. They then passed on that gene for resistance to their offspring, and then they went ahead and repopulated. And that means that their offspring are going to become less and less affected by the antibiotics. And you can explain insecticide resistance in the same exact way. Now, if we look at COVID, the orange line that we see right here is the mutations that we see in other parts of the CoV-2 virus. But this red right there line is where the mutations in the spike protein are occurring. So an amino acid position of the spike protein normally had aspartate, which is written as D in a biochemical shorthand in the primary sequence. But a mutation at the 614th place of this gene began to replace this aspartate with glycine, and its biochemical shorthand is G. Now, because of a copying fault that altered that single nucleotide in the virus's RNA code, that virologists were calling D614G mutation. The first letter tells you the original amino acid was D, right? That was the aspartate. The number itself was its position in the primary sequence of that spike gene, and the last letter is what the amino acid mutated to, right? That the G. So in that case, it was our glycine. So this represents a more transmissible form of this SARS-CoV-2. And this is a strain that is rapidly beginning to show up and become the dominant strain in Europe, and it's taken hold in the United States, Canada, Australia. And so we can actually see evolution occurring. How's that for evidence?